Hi and welcome to this video. My name is Yannis and the video should be great for you if you want to learn how to make your first synthesizer sounds in Ableton Live. By the end of this video you're going to have some instrument like this that helps you understand all the important parameters and the basics, because I kind of show you what matters and what doesn't matter, so you can actually connect them to this rack and also give them colors so it's more understandable for you, and explore the relationship between those different parameters and even store them as your cute little presets on the left side, which is pretty cool. So you have a sound like this, for example, or something like this, or maybe even some drum sounds, which is also super fun. And I made sure that it's applicable to all versions, since there's one synth called Drift that is available also in Ableton Live Lite, so that's not going to be some restriction. As I mentioned, we're going to use a synth called Drift, and you have to create a MIDI track first, and then you need to go to your instruments, to Drift, and simply drag it onto that MIDI track. You can play it either with your computer keyboard or a MIDI controller, so once you arm the track, you can use a MIDI keyboard like I have here. But also you can press M on your computer keyboard and simply play it with the keys of your keyboard. Now, for getting the sort of device you saw in the intro, where we can also add our own colors and basically make a selection of the settings that are most important, we need to once click on the device and then press Command and G. This type of device is called Instrument Rack, and on the left side you can open the macro view where we can assign the controls we think are most important and can also add the colors. And this icon opens the preset menu where we can later store our favorite sounds. And maybe you ask yourself, why are we going to create this instrument rack? Isn't it possible to learn Drift inside the Drift interface? Which is a great question, and yes, of course, you can totally learn the synth just by using the Drift interface. I just made the experience, also based on my own synth learning process, that it's really great to narrow down the synth into the most important settings, because there are lots of things that are great, but not that important in the first place, because I suppose you're new to synthesizers, and having all settings at your disposal might confuse you more than giving you some basic overview on what really matters. And by creating this type of instrument rack, I just want to help you understanding what's really important, what really matters, before you can also dig deeper into all the modulation stuff. But there are some things we need to do inside the Drift interface anyways, because once you load it up, you have two oscillators activated, and oscillators are basically like voices. So if I only have one oscillator, I have one voice. If I have two, I have two voices. You see, the second one is some octave lower. We can also, for example, put it some octave higher, detune it, which is all really fun. But for understanding the basics, I recommend to start with only one oscillator, so we're going to deselect this one. For each oscillator, you have different types of waveforms, and you can open this menu here and actually see those different shapes. This is called a sine wave, a triangle wave. This one is like a variation of a triangle wave. Also, this one, I don't know the exact name. Those are like some special waveforms. The most typical ones are those two, like sine and triangle wave, and also sawtooth wave and square wave. And this is kind of a modified rectangle square wave. So the four most basic ones are sine, triangle, square, and sawtooth. And this is also the first control we can assign to macro 1. So you need to right click on the waveform and then simply map it to macro 1. So you can use this control now for changing between the different types of waveforms. So there's a sine wave, like a triangle wave, then the modified one, another modified one, the sawtooth wave. You see it has way more frequency content and sounds way more present. The rectangle wave and the square wave. Another great control we can map to our macros is shape. And let's see what it does. So here you see a sine wave. And once you move shape, you basically add some complexity and overtones to the sine wave. This is actually great with Drift, that you can always visually see what happens. And we simply map the shape to our second macro. I also like to map the volume of oscillator 1 to a macro, and also the volume of the noise, because it's great to have one tonal oscillator for melodic stuff and one noise oscillator for some noise stuff or for some ambient stuff, and we'll check later what you can actually do with it. That's kind of our first section. I would call it the tone section, because this is where we define the basic tone. And let's pick a color, for example, some sort of blue. So we add the blue color, so you have to right click on the macro and then you can select the color. And you can also modify the name. So here, for example, for me it's enough to just call it wave. I also use caps usually for those macros, because it needs to be something short and clear. There's not so much space and this OSC1 is already a little confusing, I feel. So I just call it shape. And here I call it oscillator volume. Often I use short forms, like for oscillator, it's often OSC. And here it's like noise volume and VOL for volume. Next, we're going to explore the envelope, the ADSR envelope, which stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. And it basically defines the behavior of the note once you press a key, because at the moment it's like super static, always exactly the same behavior. And first, let's actually map them. So we map the attack to macro 5, the decay to macro 6, the sustain to macro 7, and the release to macro 8. Let's actually open up the shape so the sound is a little more interesting. And the sustain is maybe good to start with because it basically means how loud or how much of the sound there is once you keep the note pressed. So if I put this to 0, we have a little bit of sound in the beginning, but then it's gone because the sustain is at 0. But if I increase it, we get the sound back. And attack and decay determine the way to the sustain. So for example, the attack means if the note is there right away, like a short attack means it's really punchy and direct, but if it's a long attack, we get some longer swell. All the way to 100% of the sound, and when it reaches 100%, we start the decay phase, and the decay is basically the time it needs from the 100% volume after the attack phase to go down to the sustain. So actually, for making it some very clear example, let's bring down the sustain to 20%, have like a 2-second attack and a 2-second decay. And you will hear now that we slowly increase the volume and then it decreases and stays at the sustain at about 20%. And the longer you make the decay, the longer it actually takes to go down to 20%. And the release determines how much time the note needs to disappear once you release the key. So if it's a very long release, I will tell you once I release the key. Now, so there's a lot of after ringing, but if it's really short, the sound will be gone right away. Now I released the key. And now would be a good moment to explore the envelopes, and you can click on this icon on the left side for closing drift. It's still active, but you just don't see it. You only see those macros, and you start making some sounds just with the envelope and the different shapes. And I think you can spend already quite some time here. And just as an example, because I mentioned the noise, it's really fun to add the noise. And if you have some short envelope, for example, like a direct attack, a very short decay, no sustain, you have some little hi-hat. And the more you open the decay, the brighter it actually gets, the more, or the thicker. And here you can apply also some release. This is some more general noise hit. Or you can also make some slow noise swells by adding some long attack, for example, increasing the sustain and the decay. And this sounds really great with reverb. I have some long reverb here. It's the stock reverb of Ableton. It looks like this. And let's send it into the reverb. So you can always send your individual tracks into a reverb. It's really great. And for long synthesizer sounds, a long reverb is really great. So it sounds like this. Or alternatively, you can make some kind of string sounds if you use the oscillator and some slow attack. Actually, we can use probably exactly the same settings. Although this sounds a little more like some other type of instrument, we can change to the sawtooth wave. This is the only limitation here because we don't really know where we are. So sometimes it's good to open drift to see what kind of waveform you pick. And with sawtooth waves, it should sound a little more interesting. That's a good foundation, although we're still missing one of the most charismatic part of any synthesizer, which is the filter, and we're going to check it out next. So let's open Drift, and the filter section is here, and we need more macros, so we can click the plus icon a couple of times. We're going to use all 16. And one of the most important control for any synthesizer, and also one of the most fun controls for actually live manipulation, is the cutoff frequency, which is this big knob here. And we're going to map it to macro 9. And what it does, it basically takes away frequency content. So if I bring it all the way to the left side, we almost don't hear anything. Here you start hearing it. So that's actually quite fun, and you can also add resonance. It's also one of the most basic controls. We can also right-click and assign it to macro 10, because it creates some sort of resonant peak. And here you have some visual representation. So once I increase the resonance, you see that it creates this peak, and especially if you go down to lower frequency amounts, it becomes really audible. Actually, I'm going to increase it while playing a note. That's actually a great vintage type sound when you increase the resonance and just move a little the cutoff frequency with one basic note. It's somehow really enjoyable to hear this tiny filter movement and the changing resonance with the frequencies. Now, what's missing though is a little bit of movement, and you can use something called filter envelope, which means this envelope we have here also gets applied to the filter, which can make the sound more bouncy and more present. And we need to go to this lower menu here, the frequency modulation, and we don't need the pressure. So we click on it and simply select envelope 1, which is this one, and change this to 0, and also right click and assign this or map this to macro 11. For the demonstration, let's change the sound a little to something more bouncy. I want to create some sort of bass sound, so we bring the attack all the way to the left side, although 1 is always better than 0, because at 0 we get some clicks. Decay, maybe something like this, no sustain, and a little bit of release. And resonance could be here. And we're going to bring the frequency all the way down, because now it's going to be some super dull sound. Barely hear anything. But once we apply the filter envelope, it gets super interesting. Actually, let's get rid of the reverb. You get this classic synth bass sound, and you can even increase the amount, making it super bright in the beginning. And what happens is that it starts with the filter fully opened, but then with the settings of this envelope, it brings down the frequency. You can see it here, but it's actually a quite fast movement. It's bring the decay to a higher value, so you can hear the movement of the filter a little longer. So now it takes 5 seconds from being fully open to being all the way down to 30 Hertz. Or even longer. And it also works into the other direction, so you get those long morphing sounds, for example, especially if you stay in the bass register. And if we increase the resonance again, we organically, without having to move the filter knob, get this interesting sound we had a couple of minutes ago. Kind of fun. And those 11 settings, I would say you can really explore now, because those are the very basics. The ones I'm going to show you are also, I would still consider them basics, but those are the basics. And we didn't color code yet, so let's actually add a color to the envelope, maybe something orange. And also, so this is like envelope, tone, and this would be filter. So for filter, let's maybe use something green. And you can already create quite a few cool sounds like this. And this is why I also want to show you already how you can store them. So you have to click on this icon on the left side. And let's say we want to store the sound. We click on new. Once click this, I think it's a camera icon. And then we give it a certain name. So I call this long swell or resonance swell. Wheezo swell, and store it. And then you can create new ones. So here you see once you create the new one and you move certain parameters, you see this little star here, which means you changed something. And once you click save, you actually saved it. And then you can, for example, also make a short bouncy sound like we had before. So shape is also really fun to explore with sounds like this. So we could store this like as a bouncy bass, for example. And you can easily change between them, which is super amazing. So here's the long swell. And then there's the bouncy bass. And I like this so much because if you store drift presets, you don't really see the difference in a simple view, because here you can see, okay, the long wheezo swell has a long attack, and then you open the bouncy bass, you see it has a short attack. Actually, I said it needs to be 1. Let's quickly change this to 1. And it makes sense to see what those knobs do. And you don't see it as clearly if you just open up new drift presets. And it's more like having one analog synthesizer, because this is like a selection I also have on my Vermona Performer, for example, that makes you learn some instrument instead of just creating presets. And I think this is something extremely important for learning a synthesizer. And I also quickly adjusted the names of the macros. So here for me it's enough to have attack, decay, sustain, and release. And here I called it cutoff, reso, and filter envelope. By the way, in case you enjoyed this video and feel like supporting the channel, you can quickly hit the like button and be also warmly invited to subscribe, since you can find lots of sound design tutorials about making sounds with synthesizers on this channel. And also, if you consider yourself a beginner, be known that I have some classes on my website about making a first song in Ableton Live, or also about synthesizer basics. And I created some discount codes, and the links are all down below in the description. And while you can have lots of fun with those 11 settings and make some great sounds with them, they are very basic, and if you don't use any modulations, there's a chance that you will get bored after a while, or you miss some movement or some, I don't know, something extra, something more spicy. And for modulations, there's some amazing tool called LFO that I want to explain to you. For finding the LFO menu, you need to scroll a little to the right, because it's here on the more right side of drift. And it has a control for the tempo, which is the most important one, because here on the LFO menu, we don't even do so much, because we can do whatever we want. We're not going to hear anything unless we apply the LFO to a certain destination. So what does that mean? For example, for the filter, you see that while we have the amount for the envelope, we can also set some amount for the LFO. So we can directly map this to macro 12. And let's make the LFO quite slow. And now once we increase the amount for the LFO filter modulation, you will see that something happens to the sound. Or actually, let's use some sustain, so we have some sustained note. There's some movement that gets applied. And if we change now the speed of the LFO, you will see that also this movement will get faster or slower depending on where we move. So we definitely need some control for the LFO rate, and I'm going to map it to macro 15 because for the final order it made more sense to me. You will see in a bit why, but I mean you can also map them to whatever numbers you feel like. And a very classic setting is the tremolo setting, which means you set the LFO rate, for example, at around 6 Hz and apply a little bit for getting this kind of tremolo effect. This kind of warm wobble, I really like this effect. And another typical modulation destination for the LFO is the pitch. And here you see already some pitch modulation menu that has some LFO pre-selected. So we only have to assign the percentage to macro 14. Again, macro 13 we'll get to in a second. It's another type of pitch modulation that I want to share with you. And let's make the sound a little more melodic. So I go to some higher octave with a little more filter. And let's get rid of the tremolo. And now if you add, actually with a similar speed, like 6 Hertz, some pitch modulation, you get something called vibrato, and it can sound really pleasing if you just add a little bit. Like this is quite static. Also sounds great for those long, more string type sounds, especially when you send them into a reverb. And if you use some super high LFO speed and a high amount of LFO modulation to the pitch, you can get some quite cool distorted experimental sounds. Now, there's one more cool LFO modulation that is kind of a little more experimental, but I feel like it's still super great even if you're a beginner. And we need to go to drift once, because you see here this slide control, because here for the shape you can control, or you can select something that controls the shape amount. And again, you can click on it and select the LFO, which means now we can map this percentage to macro 16. And the LFO gets applied to the shape, so we get some very interesting modulation. Like if we would move this shape icon, it can sound quite experimental in certain cases. Let's actually make it a bit slower and then slowly bring it in. Oh, and actually get rid of the pitch modulation. I like it a lot. It's a little more modern also. Again, you can get quite experimental. But also I like the slow modulation. And now there's only one macro left, which I used for something called pitch envelope. And let's get rid of the LFO shape modulation. And it's next to the LFO we already assigned. So here you need to change it to envelope 1, because as you can see, here are 2 envelopes and you can use 2 envelopes, but this would be a good example of making it already a little more complex. And using the same envelope for everything just makes you understand the movement and the connections a little better. So this needs to be changed to envelope 1. And then you can assign the percentage control to macro 13. And the reason why I include it is because it's needed for creating some drum sounds. So let's actually change this to a sine wave. Just a basic setting, and make it quite short, no sustain. Let's actually go a little lower, so it might sound a bit more like a kick drum, no reverb. So like this, it doesn't really have a punch, but if you then add the pitch modulation, you get this interesting attack. Actually, let's get rid of the filter envelope. So you get some kind of kick drums. Really fun. And also, if you bring in the noise, you will actually get some sort of snare, which is also quite fun sound. Maybe sometimes you need to reduce the amount again a little. Also, yeah, like this. I mean, it's a very basic snare, but you can create quite some drum sounds with this one rack. And here's how I actually colored and named them. So the 12th macro I called filter LFO and also used the same colors for the filter, so it's connected to this one. Then this is basically like pitch modulation, both with the envelope and the LFO. LFO speed has its own color, and shape LFO I actually colored in the same color, or I used the same color as for the tone, because we modulate the shape, and here we modulate the filter, it has the same color, so that's what made sense for me, but you can also reorganize and restructure those, of course. If you want, you can download the device for free, the link is down below in the description, but we know that there's also some additional option, including some presets. So here you can see that there are 20 macro presets, different styles like string, pad, detune, lead, broken dub, acid type, noise cloud, flute, dystopia. So different types of sounds that you can learn from, because you will always see, okay, here they are set up in this way, so if I do it this way, I get this type of sound. I think you can learn a lot from it, and it's just for a small price, so a little upgrade to the free version. And again, you can find the link down below in the description. Otherwise, if you're interested in more sound design tutorials, check out this playlist with lots of tutorials on making synth sounds in Ableton Live. And here is another playlist with some more general tips on music production. And apart from that, I wish you lots of inspiration with whatever it is that you create, and hope to see you soon again at this channel. Bye.